what would someone get out of adopting some version of spiritual beliefs? What would they get out of it? Well, that's kind of the wrong question, because you're already starting from a humanistic framework. You're already assuming that I am the center of the universe, and therefore only if it benefits me in tangible ways should I engage or adopt that belief system. Within a materialistic worldview, where you do not believe in any higher realities, who cares if you live a pleasant 80 years or a short and miserable 5? In the grand scheme of things, it makes absolutely no difference. You're dead, and there was nothing more than what you happen to accidentally experience or by happenstance encounter during your life. There is no objective truth. There is no objective morality. There is no objective framework of ethics. It's whatever you want. It's not a blind leap of faith, which a lot of people think it is. They're like, well, I could never become, a religious person because I require evidence, and I require rationality and logic, and accepting faith is the inverse or the opposite of that. That is simply not true.
All right, Joshua, when I look at your life and what you have done, including the 2 decades of missionary work across multiple continents, it feels like you are driven by a strong conviction that spirituality lies at the heart of human flourishing. You also seem to carry the belief that modern Western culture suffers greatly from a loss of meaning. So if this is a big question, but if what I just said is true, how do you feel society can reconnect with true meaning again?
Yeah, I think there has been a historical disconnect in Western civilization, particularly, and it's a gradual, drift, and so it's difficult to blame one particular thing or one particular element of society, because it's a compounding effect. But I think in broad strokes, most would agree that Western civilization draws heavily from Greek thinking, Greek philosophy, and so we are very, or at least we like to think of ourselves as very rational, logical, scientifically oriented people, both individually and collectively, and more recently, with the Enlightenment in the 1700s, there was a huge explosion of curiosity and kind of exploring the world around us. And originally, that was kind of interested in all different categories, including spirituality. But as the Enlightenment kind of tapered off toward the end of the 1700s, we really started to see Western civilization's curiosity kind of narrow and focus on curiosity only about the physical world. And so there was a big explosion in scientific inquiry, but philosophy and theology really began to taper off, both in interest, prominence, and even kind of acceptability, in quote unquote polite culture. And then that began to kind of self-reinforce to the point to where kind of philosophy and theology were looked down upon, as if they were no longer relevant and no longer had any useful or beneficial use in society. And so as a result, this kind of myopic focus on scientific inquiry then brought about a worldview of materialism, that not only was science the most interesting thing, but it was the only thing. And then from there, people really started to struggle because nature abhors a vacuum, and without any real philosophical or theological leg to stand on any longer, people started to fill in the gap, and what they largely turned to as kind of a logical building up on the foundation of materialism was if there is no greater meaning, if there is no greater purpose in life, if we're all just random accidents floating around in a meaningless universe, then the only meaning we can really derive is our own happiness and pleasure. Back in Greek philosophy, this would have been known as hedonism. In modern culture and society, we tend to refer to it as humanism, but just the idea that my own happiness, my own pleasure, is really the only thing that I can derive any kind of meaning from. And that sounds good at first because it's all about me. And so I get to seek whatever interests me, whatever brings me happiness, whatever brings me pleasure. But as we've kind of run this social experiment for a couple hundred years now, what we found is that it's incredibly shallow, incredibly unfulfilling, and has led to massive rates of depression and anxiety and kind of a domino effect of other health issues, mental health issues, and physical health issues in our society. I could give some examples, but I don't want to be too long-winded in my response here. But we've kind of come to this place in our society where we've run the experiment and we're kind of realizing, okay, this isn't what we were hoping for. This isn't what we thought the fruit of this worldview was going to be. And a lot of people are desperate for true meaning, true purpose, something greater than themselves. And so we're seeing a shift in our society. I wouldn't say it's a major or dominant theme that the majority of people are. This isn't front page news. This isn't on your 10 o'clock news on the TV. But there is a very strong undercurrent, which polls are currently showing us, of people who are very disaffected, very dissatisfied with the status quo of what society has told them would bring them happiness, and they're looking for answers elsewhere.
Mm-hmm. I think within the context of the conversation we're about to have, it's good to start at the basics and break down a couple of concepts that you mentioned. So before we actually delve into the deeper part of what you just said, let's start with Enlightenment, because you mentioned that a couple of 100 years ago, this thing called Enlightenment started. What is that?
Well, I mean, it was a movement within our culture, within our society, and there's cycles, all sorts of cycles within society. Mm-hmm. We kind of swing from one pole of a pendulum to another. And prior to the Enlightenment, to give a little bit of context of why our society kind of swung that direction so hard, prior to the Enlightenment was kind of an age of what many would kind of characterize as stifling religiosity. The Victorian age, where certain topics were kind of taboo, religious norms were pretty strict. And so there was this external pressure on the individual to adhere to a very strict cultural code, or even a moral or ethical code. And humanity is just naturally reactive. You might even call them naturally rebellious. And so we will endure a certain kind of paradigm or worldview for only a certain amount of time before we react to that and kind of go in an opposite direction. Oftentimes that's pivotal within generations. Kind of children naturally want to rebel against their parents and what their parents believed and what they have thought and how they have behaved, et cetera, et cetera. So you kind of go through these generational cycles, and those generational changes or reactions kind of add up and hit a critical mass at some point to where the majority of the population is thinking radically different than previous generations. And so you kind of get a civilizational or really societal shift into a new direction. And so you had the Victorian age of kind of strict religiosity, and then right after that, then you had this explosion, this kind of rebellion against that in the form of the Enlightenment. And like, let's kind of cast off the beliefs and the norms and the restrictions of our forefathers, and let's rediscover what reality around us is and how we can interact with it. And so again, there was an explosion of scientific interest and inquiry, as well as philosophical and theological. And so seances, for example, were extremely popular during the Enlightenment. There was this idea that there is a spiritual realm, that it's real, that we can interact with it, that we can gain knowledge and insight from it. But again, toward the tail end of that movement, the theological and philosophical inquiry kind of tapered off as we really began to focus in on a naturalistic or materialistic worldview. And that has kind of been the course that Western civilization has been on for the last few hundred years.
Right. So the argument, in short, that you're making is that religion and beliefs have been a big part of human societies for a long, long time. And up until the moment that Enlightenment started, the Enlightenment age started, and fact and objective truth, I suppose, became the things that were strived towards. The argument that you're making is that replaced beliefs more and more, and they became less relevant, let's say, at least in the perception of the of society, of humans. And what you're saying is that decline in beliefs, the consequence of that is that there is you used the word meaning crisis a couple of times in your work and in your online talks. What you're saying is the absence that is growing more and more towards religion, towards beliefs, towards, for example, Christianity, is leading people not to believe in something that is bigger than themselves, whatever that may be, but they themselves become the top of the pinnacle, right? They become very inward focused. And therefore, the argument that you're making is that leads to things like depression and anxiety, because people have nothing to serve, I suppose, anymore, or to look upon which is higher than them. They serve their happiness.
Yeah, and there's even kind of within that, there's kind of a secular arm of that, but there's also a bit of a spiritual arm in that, kind of in the form of New Age beliefs, which kind of in a spiritual framework kind of codifies the idea that kind of you're the God of your own universe. And so there has been in the New Age push even a spiritualization of the humanistic philosophy. And in the U.S. at least, that started to kind of gain traction during the hippie movement. And so it's been multiple decades at this point of both a secular push in that direction, as well as kind of a subculture, if you will, in a spiritual direction. But essentially they kind of agree on who's at the top of the pyramid or at the top of the food chain, if you will, and that's self. And so kind of in both of those aspects, I think, due to the fact that the secular push was far greater, there's a far greater number of adherents within our culture in the secular camp than there is in, say, the New Age camp. But both of them are kind of finding that it is a pretty empty, shallow, meaningless endeavor, and are starting to shift, or at least starting to ask questions and be open to other possibilities because of kind of the internal angst or dissatisfaction that they're feeling as a result of the worldview that they've adhered to.
Let me play devil's advocate for a little bit, because I do think that the conclusion that you're bringing forward makes sense. But I'm curious to hear why you came to that conclusion. Why do you think that the absence of beliefs of religious foundation within the lives of people takes away their meaning and, in extension, drives depression and anxiety? Why do you think that?
I come from a scientific background. I'm obviously a product of my own culture, and I kind of lay out my biases pretty plainly and openly in the opening chapter of my book. It's full disclosure. But I do try to speak that language to a materialistic culture, a quote unquote scientific culture. And so the tool that I would use to kind of answer that question would just be the scientific method. If we were to apply the scientific method in all areas, not just kind of referring to physical truths, but even philosophical and spiritual or theological, I think the answer to your question is an understanding which aligns with reality or with truth is going to produce quite positive outcomes. For example, if I were to develop a worldview or a philosophy or a framework of reality that acknowledged the truth of gravity, well, then that worldview is going to produce systems and structures and belief systems which align with that truth, and therefore people are going to thrive. If I were to come up with an ideology or a worldview or a framework of reality that rejected the idea of gravity, well, then you can imagine there's going to be all sorts of issues that crop up in that culture or that society because they're rejecting something that is actually true, that is actually real. And so people are, jumping off of buildings, thinking that nothing wrong could possibly happen because they've rejected a truth of the universe or of the world around us. In the same way, if I have a framework of reality which accepts kind of the duality nature or binary nature of, if you will, of males and females and the sexual reproductive reality and I get married and have kids and then humanity as a species flourishes. It continues to exist. If I come up with an ideology or framework which rejects the sexual nature of humanity and how we reproduce, then humanity is not going to flourish. If everyone were to adopt that worldview, then in one generation, literally, we would become extinct. And so, sorry, giving some random examples, but trying to paint the picture of if we were to come up with an ideology or a theory of reality which states the spiritual world or the spiritual reality is invalid, that it does not exist, but it actually is, then you would also expect to see some tense pressure within that society of trying to operate in what they want or believe to be true, but they're coming up against reality that actually is true.
Right.
And so my explanation of that would be there is a spiritual reality, and by our society rejecting that element of the world around us, we are coming up against a brick wall that is very uncomfortable, but not at all, surprising. we're coming up against a reality. Our hypothesis in the scientific method is not matching the actual data, and therefore we need to either revise the hypothesis or discard the hypothesis, so that we can actually come into better alignment with truth.
Okay, let me pick that apart for just a little bit. Let me make it practical as well. Because I think what you're saying makes sense to the degree that if you produce a belief system that is out of touch or misaligned with objective reality, with that which you can see, that creates friction. And then you create a foundation, let's say, that is unstable at best, right? So a very weird example there might be if you create a belief system that says the earth is flat, right? Or that the moon doesn't exist, or whatever, that gravity doesn't exist, to use your example, right? That doesn't make any sense because, we experience it every day. We see it every day. Well, not the round earth part, because it's very hard to see the round earth, at least from where you're sitting. But, yeah, you can watch the news and then you'll see it. But point is, that makes sense, right? So if you create a belief system that is aligned with that which we can experience, then the friction should not be there. But why? Let's make this practical. Why would I need a belief system in order to feel true meaning? So in my life, for example, I am married. I'm very happily married with a woman that I've been with for 14 years. We have a good time. We work on the podcast together. I have a wonderful job. We are good in our communities. We have a bunch of friends, and we are trying to, both of us, serve each other, but also serve our communities. And that gives us meaning, right? And work gives us a part meaning. Friendships gives us a part meaning. Having wonderful conversations with you, like on the podcast, that gives us a lot of meaning. So what would a belief system, adopting Christianity or another belief system, what would that provide for a person who is listening right now and who has the feeling like, okay, I have my life in order, I have a good community, I have good family, good friends, everything is good, right? I'm serving people and I'm helping others. What does that belief system add for them? And kind of the repeated question there is, why would the absence of that increase the likelihood of anxiety and depression for those people when their goal, let's say, is serving their community, right? Something that is not themselves.
Yeah, well, to some degree, I'm going to have to push back or even flatly reject kind of the framing of that question.
Mm-hmm.
Not because it's necessarily untrue, but because within a theological framework, it's asking the wrong question.
Mm-hmm.
Because with your question, what would someone get out of adopting some version of spiritual beliefs? What would they get out of it? Well, that's kind of the wrong question because you're already starting from a humanistic framework. You're already assuming that I am the center of the universe, and therefore only if it benefits me in tangible ways should I engage or adopt that belief system. But that is the problem, is that self is a very shallow and unfulfilling God. And so if we're just looking out for how is this going to benefit me, then we're already heading down the path of depression, anxiety, meaninglessness, and an unfulfilled life. What we really need to be asking is, what is truth, and how do I align with that? Because whatever that reality is, the closer I align with it, the better things are going to function within the world around me, but also in my own personal life. Once you get to the place where you're willing to accept at least the possibility of a spiritual reality that exists in the world around us, of course, then there's a host of other questions that one would need to ask, because obviously not all spiritual frameworks out there are the same. They are mutually exclusive in a lot of different areas. And so there's a question of which one of these spiritual frameworks or understandings, again, most closely aligns with reality. As someone who has, examined both at university, but also in my travels and personally, has examined different worldviews and different frameworks, Christianity comes out, head and shoulders ahead of others in terms of its aligning with what we can actually experience, what we can actually observe, both historically as well as spiritually to some degree. And so if we were to, and I'm not making this argument, I'm not asking everyone listening to accept this position. I'm just saying where I am from my vantage point or where I'm at in that journey. It's not a question of what I am getting out of this, because if you then come to the conclusion that Christianity is correct, you then have to accept, the premise of Christianity, which is that it's not about us. We are not the top of the food chain in the world around us. There is another being who was here for eternity past, who is much more important, if you will, than we are. And it's what he has done for us and his desire for relationship with us that is what's important. And so in the U.S., there was this World War II slogan, ask not what you can do for your country or what your country can do for you, but for what you can do for your country. And so there was this understanding that, hey, it's not just about you. And if we're just serving self and self-interest, then you've already lost the plot. And that is exemplified in Christianity in that it is a sacrificial understanding. It is a sacrificial philosophy and theology, which was set by God himself, who came and served and died on a cross for us. And so the question is, what is meaning? Well, meaning, if we accept that premise or that framework, meaning is reconnecting with the divine. It's reconnecting with the one who created us, the one who desires relationship with us. That is the plumb line, if you will. That is the metric of truth. And so as we align with that, as we come into that understanding and we stop living for self, start living for God first and foremost, but then also serving others around us as he commanded, then meaning and purpose naturally comes into play because we are aligned with that truth. But I think when it's virtually impossible to define meaning or define purpose unless you're first constructing a premise or a foundation of what is truth. There are, of course, worldviews such as materialism, which cannot objectively define meaning and purpose because inherently it believes there is no meaning or purpose. But within a spiritual framework, depending on which spiritual framework you are adhering to or adopting or even examining, there is going to be a different definition or outworking of what is meaning and purpose based on what the premise of your worldview is. So I think it's challenging to, meaning and purpose can't just kind of float out in the ether all by themselves in self-contained definitions and kind of axioms. By necessity, they have to be tied to a larger framework to define what meaning and purpose are and even how they function. And so within a Christian worldview, meaning and purpose comes from our relationship with the one who created us, as his design and his wisdom and his purposes can therefore be manifest in our lives. If you were to adopt a completely different spiritual framework, New Age, for example, or Buddhism, or Hinduism, or Islam, or animism, or shamanism. Like, each of those frameworks are going to define meaning and purpose differently. And so then the question again is, okay, out of all of those frameworks, which seems to be aligning with reality the closest, which is producing the most good fruit, if you will, the most productivity, the most flourishing, the most meaning and purpose as people are defining it. Is this something that is bringing life and life abundantly, or is this worldview producing death and destruction and anxiety and kind of a disconnect from the reality around them? And that is not an easy, it's an easy question to ask, but of course, doing the legwork to actually discover and do the research and the homework on each of those worldviews is an involved process. And there's, at the university level, there's plenty of courses you can take on comparative religions, but none of them are looking at, none of the college courses that I've ever been in or have seen are asking those types of questions of, out of all of these worldviews, which seems to be producing the best fruit? Out of all of these religious worldviews, which seems to be producing the most human flourishing? Because in most of the time when you're taking a comparative religious course, it's either under kind of the umbrella of cultural anthropology, or maybe you're actually getting a degree in a particular religious study. But under how I studied and under cultural anthropology, there's this default premise that you first have to accept, that all cultures are kind of equally valid or equally beneficial. It's not a demonstrable premise. We can obviously look out into the world, and you and I had a little discussion about this before the podcast, about different nations in certain areas of the world that obviously are not flourishing. Things obviously are not going well for them, and they've struggled not just recently or in a small little bubble of time, but they have been struggling for a very long time. And so you have to ask the question, and others have, and have come up with very demonstrable and solid data results, that there's clearly worldviews which function and produce more human flourishing than others. And so the cultural anthropological perspective that kind of all cultures and all societal belief systems are on equal footing is demonstrably false. And yet, when we're studying religious worldviews within that cultural anthropological umbrella, that's kind of our default assumption. And so therefore, we're not even willing to ask those kinds of questions. Okay, well, let's take Islam, or let's take animism, or let's take shamanism and compare it to Christianity or Judaism or Buddhism, and see which one is actually producing the best outcomes for humanity. Which one seems to be aligning with the reality that we actually live in. Those are not kind of permissible questions, because we're just assuming that, the coexist bumper sticker, that all truths and all religious claims or spiritual claims are either equally valid or equally invalid if you're a materialist and believe it's all just a bunch of nonsense. And so I think we're not even willing to take the next step and apply the scientific method to those questions, because it's almost unthinkable. We haven't even come to the premise that we could possibly test these ideologies or these worldviews. But if we were actually to go beyond the standard cultural anthropological perspective and reject that all truth claims are equally valid, and actually apply some inquiry, some curiosity, and some objective metrics to those worldviews, we would find, once again, that the Judeo-Christian worldview inevitably comes out on top. And this is not bias confirmation. It's not, religious or Christian researchers trying to validate their own beliefs and worldview. There's been many books and many papers from people who are irreligious or even atheist who have all come to this exact same conclusion, that if we're honestly evaluating spiritual beliefs or worldviews or frameworks, the Judeo-Christian framework comes out on top every single time. The Indian scholar Vishal Mangawati wrote a very thick book called The Book That Made Your World, evaluating this question. There was a scholar researcher out of the University of Singapore named Robert Woodbury, who wrote a groundbreaking paper on this called the missionary roots of liberal democracy, showing wherever the Bible went, flourishing, typically in the form of democracy, higher education, literacy rates, health outcomes, et cetera, like it all increased wherever the Bible went. Vishal Mangawati's work showed the same thing. Even atheist scholar Neil Ferguson, in his research that he did, I believe it was for his book Empire, came to the same conclusion. As an atheist and as a Brit, his default assumption was that in the early days of the British Empire, when they were sending missionaries to their colonies, he expected the typical social anthropology or cultural anthropological perspective was that wherever the missionaries went, wherever Christianity went to the colonies, it destroyed their culture, destroyed, their beliefs, and society suffered as a result. And after the research, he came to the exact opposite conclusion as an atheist. No, actually, wherever the Bible went, wherever Christian missionaries went, things got better across the board. So that was a very surprising result for him as an atheist. But there's just very few scholars who are kind of willing to ask that question and then do the homework and use objective metrics to come to a conclusion. Because again, it's very politically incorrect. It's very socially awkward to even ask the question.
Yeah, and maybe not just politically correct, but I think the answer that you gave in the beginning, so there's a whole bunch of things that you just said. So I'm going to cherry pick some things out of there and bring it back to that original question that I asked, because my question was not necessarily framed at, what does it do for me applying a belief system to my life as someone who has, a good life, a good marriage, a good friendship, a good community, and all that sort of stuff. It's more, one of the things that you asked yourself out loud while you were speaking was, okay, what is meaning, right? And that someone from a secular perspective has a hard time coming up with a definition for meaning. And I would say that if I look through the lens of someone who's secular, I would say something along the lines of meaning is serving that which is higher than yourself. But that doesn't necessarily mean God. That might also mean your community, right? So in the situation, and this is kind of rephrasing the exact question, but I'm failing to see where that answer comes in. Someone in a position that has a good marriage, that is stable for their community, that provides a net benefit for their surroundings, right? So they are generally agreed upon good for their surroundings and their community. What benefit does implementing a social structure of a belief system with that person? Because I think what you're saying to a certain degree makes sense. That the framing of this question implies that the answer should be something that is beneficial for the person who is serving that community, but it is not. It's an outward force. That person is serving their community. So the answer to the question is not just aimed at that person receiving the benefits, but that whole community receiving the benefits, right? So that which is meaningful is, I think, serving that which is higher than yourself. But there's a whole bunch of things that can be higher than yourself, as long as you don't place yourself at the pinnacle, right? Because then you're dealing with narcissism or selfishness or whatever you want to call it. So that person serving their surroundings might find meaning, and therefore it doesn't have to necessarily delve into the realm of depression and anxiety. So what you're saying, okay, to wrap it up, what you're saying to a certain degree makes sense, because I think that having a belief system in place means that you have a strong and solid foundation, ideally, that you can stand on and that you can operate from, and that you know that you're operating from a certain form of truth, whatever that truth is, so that the choices that you are making are aligned to that guiding star that you're following. Right? That makes perfect sense. And I also know that people having vision, right? People knowing the point that they want to reach into the future, and thus creating that guiding star for themselves, I know that takes away anxiety. That is just generally agreed upon, right? If you, for example, if you look at students who have at a university, and they have a dropout rate of, like, let's say 50%, the moment you let them formulate a vision for what they want to do in the future and let them break it down into actionable steps, therefore letting them nurture a vision, that lowers the dropout rate. So per definition, it means having that guiding star decreases depression, anxiety, but it decreases a bunch of bad things from happening. So to that degree, what you're saying makes sense. But what I'm trying to figure out right now is, for that person who is listening right now and who has their stuff in order and who has that life and who is stable in their community and who is serving their community, why do you think in that specific situation, implementing a belief system into that mix is of a net benefit?
Well, for a couple of reasons. First of all, I think we would need to establish within a materialistic worldview where you do not believe in any higher realities. The theological or the spiritual reality within your worldview is either of no consequence or it simply does not exist. Then you're accepting the premise that life is inherently meaningless and purposelessness. Okay? Within a materialistic worldview where the Big Bang occurred for no particular reason, there was no cause, it was a cosmic accident, and then random chemicals and elements within the natural world bumped into each other and eventually formed chemical compounds and proteins, which then eventually, formed life very magically. We have no idea how that process could have occurred. But if you accept that premise, then you have to then come to the conclusion by necessity that there is no meaning or purpose in life. And therefore, whatever things that you are attributing to being meaningful or purposeful are completely random and arbitrary. And so within that worldview, my first question would be, what makes serving your community give you any meaning or purpose? Because ultimately, it is completely meaningless. All of humanity, and this is where the humanistic philosophy comes in. The philosophy says, well, if we serve others or for the net benefit of humanity as a species, well, then that is quote unquote good or helpful or beneficial, and therefore it is meaningful and has purpose. But they're completely missing the foundational truth of their entire worldview, which is, who cares? Who cares if humanity is flourishing? We're just one species out of a multitude that ultimately is going to die off regardless of what we do. It has absolutely no meaning. It has absolutely no purpose. Like, who cares if Western society flourishes right now or if we all just shoot each other and die? Because ultimately that has absolutely no impact on the universe around us.
You could make the argument there, though, that the conclusion doesn't necessarily devalue the journey, right? So the argument that you could make over there is, like, if you serve your community for the time that they are alive and they live in a way that is according, I don't like to use the word happiness in this context, but it's just a good life for many different reasons, right? You could make the argument that is the journey. And if the journey is good, then sure, if the universe blows up 7 billion years later, is perfectly fine, but it doesn't take away the fact that during those 80 years that those people are alive right now, their life is good, and therefore that is the meaning. Why the extension to the ultimate demise of humanity, or why is the journey itself not meaningful?
Because we have to define our terms here. What is good within this worldview?
Mm-hmm.
And what makes it good? What makes it have any purpose or have any value? Because again, there is no ultimate answer to any of those questions. Again, who cares if you live a pleasant 80 years or a short and miserable 5? In the grand scheme of things, it makes absolutely no difference. You're dead, and there was nothing more than what you happen to accidentally experience or by happenstance encounter during your life. And so again, without a foundational purpose and meaning, there is no greater purpose and meaning. Yes, you're absolutely correct. You can arbitrarily insert any meaning system that you would like to, because again, your truth is your truth. And so we can all live by our own axioms and our own philosophies and our own frameworks of what we value. Sure, absolutely. But objectively, none of it matters. Objectively, it doesn't matter if you grow up to be a serial killer or the next pope. There's meaning in life. And so, hey, whatever made you feel good? Well, killing other people and eating their flesh, that makes me feel good. Why should I not be able to pursue that course of life? If there's no objective meaning, if there's no objective definition of good, if there's no objective morality or ethics guiding us, because it's all just personal opinion and preference, again, we get into this system of chaos and anarchy as each individual pursues whatever the heck makes them feel meaning or purpose or happiness or pleasure, or insert emotional, response here, that you prefer. And so the secular or the materialistic worldview is really open, or I would say its logical conclusion or fruit, the end result of that is ultimately always going to be chaos and anarchy, and no objective meaning or purpose. I'm glad that the kind of the value systems that you're inserting arbitrarily into your life are far more productive, I would say, than if you were pursuing a life of crime. But again, there's no objective metric to determine which one of those is truly good versus which one isn't. It's simply preference. And so what a spiritual acknowledgement, a framework of the acknowledgement of a spiritual reality allows for, doesn't necessarily produce, but it allows for greater meaning and purpose, because there is actually something greater than ourselves. In a materialistic worldview, we are arbitrarily inserting whatever we want to act as something greater than ourselves, but it's a delusion. It's not objectively greater than ourselves. It's not that government or serving others or serving your community is objectively greater than serving yourself, because again, they're in no foundation for that philosophical framework. It is simply your preference. It is what you have inserted into a chaotic and meaningless universe to produce meaning and purpose in your life. But it is not objectively more true than any other framework or any other random metric or meaning that someone would insert into their meaningless, purposeless, chaotic life. And so we have here a foundation. And what I am arguing is that if we accept this spiritual reality, well, then we have to grapple with some way, way bigger questions than simply what is the meaning and purpose in life. If there are spiritual realities, then we then have to start grappling with the question of what happens when this life ends. And that's where, if you do want to bring it back to what am I going to get out of this? What could a spiritual perspective benefit your average listener? It's that it does bring meaning and purpose here and now, but it also provides the greater understanding of reality around us, that there is a being who is higher, more intelligent, more moral, and eternal, and therefore there are implications of, are we aligning with his truth as we live or not? And therefore there are eternal implications for what happens when I do draw my last breath in this material world. If there is a spiritual world, then that means something happens afterward. And so it's very short-sighted to just look, what are the benefits that I get out of, a spiritual worldview or belief in God now? Well, there's an entire eternity that we're also talking about. And so there's multiple levels of kind of evaluation, if you will, that we're talking about. But the first question is a spiritual reality true? Does it exist? If it does exist, then there are implications of that which I have to grapple with. And some of those implications will benefit me, again, as I align more with truth and reality. But there's other implications in that there is another being in this equation that I have to consider. And what is their expectation of me and my behavior and my actions and my heart. So there's multiple levels that we could go into here, and I don't want to drag on too long, but I think you're kind of missing the premise, number one, in that ultimately, in a materialistic framework, there is no meaning or purpose, period. There is nothing that you can ground it on. You can arbitrarily insert your own preferences, priorities, or values within that, but there is no way for you to actually ground it to something real. It's just your opinion. If it works for you, great.
I think it depends on how far you want to go, because I agree to a certain extent that a belief system like Christianity provides a very strong foundation. So I think if we get the definitions right on the table, and I think that if we talk about, for example, what is goodness, and if we break it down to its absolute core to decide where actual goodness comes from, I think the deepest possible answer that you can get comes from the Bible. That's what I think. I think there is no way that you can provide a proper definition, because from a secular perspective, I think it will be something along the lines of that which doesn't harm humans or humanity in total, something along those lines. But I think that is the deepest that you can go from a secular perspective. However, what I do not necessarily reject, but I notice resistance to the idea that if there is no adoption of belief system, then automatically that brings forward the idea that everything is pointless and meaningless. And that is true if you look at the conclusion, I think. So if you look at the conclusion and you break everything down to its absolute core, and you say, okay, where does that need to be good for your community come from, right? If you, once again, play that game and you keep on digging in both the secular perspective and in both the Christian perspective, I think the Christian perspective goes deeper. That makes perfect sense. But that I don't think that invalidates the other perspective, because one could take the argument that providing, and this is not necessarily, I'm not bringing this forward necessarily that this is my argument, but from a secular perspective, I could make the argument that, that need to serve others and to be good for your community, and again, you can define goodness and you can define serve very, very deeply, so we can play the definition game. But that by itself right now is meaningful, because if we take away the conclusion that the world blows up in 7 billion years, and we look at this moment, I can say right now, you are alive and I am alive. So if I do right now something that is good for you, right? And it helps you have a better life, a more beautiful life. It brings you happiness, it brings you joy, those kind of things. Then that by itself is the meaning, because it doesn't matter that in 60 or 70 years you die. And you can make the argument that then it's pointless because the whole life didn't mean anything. It does, because you are alive right now. You have that experience right now. So the fact that I can make your life better and easier from your perspective, right? If those will be your words, that by itself might be meaningful. And then if you ask the question, why is that meaningful? And what do you serve then? There's multiple ways to approach that. And once again, dependent on the road that you take, you come to a different conclusion. Because if you take the Christian perspective, I think, if you play this game in the Christian perspective, you would say something along the lines of, if you align yourself properly to serve God, that means you automatically align yourself to serve that which is the highest. That also means that you try to aim everything around you to point up, right? To become better, to aim higher, which then means, and it also comes together with a very good definition I've heard a good friend of mine give about, what is love? He answered that question with helping someone reach heaven, right? I think that's a beautiful definition. I think that's an upwards aimed definition, right? I think that's a definition that is aimed at helping your surroundings aim higher. But then the question becomes, what is highest? Right? And from a Christian perspective, that is God. From a secular perspective, that might be the universe or humanity. But there is a pinnacle over there. And people can have different pinnacles. And if the pinnacle of a person is, let me serve humanity, right? Because that provides a net positive to everybody. Why would stacking a layer on top of that, of divinity on top of that, of serving God on top of that, why would that make his or her action better? Because he or she is already aimed at aiming up, at aiming higher. And the friction specifically in your answer that I feel is the conclusion that if it's not aimed at God, that action is meaningless. I don't think that's true. I think that maybe...
Well, it's ultimately meaningless.
Well, it can also be implicit, right? Because if you make it explicit, you say something along the lines of, whatever I do to serve that which is the highest, which is God, right? And that is the explicit declaration that you're aiming at the highest. But maybe the implicit thing that people can feel is they want to serve their community, right? And maybe that is implicitly also aiming to that which is the highest. And they might not even realize that they have that belief system, right? They just feel that is the proper thing to do. And that, you can ask the question, why do you think that's the proper thing to do? And you can break that down, then you get a spiritual answer probably. But the absence of the explicit notion that God is the highest, automatically transferring into the idea that life is meaningless, that to me seems too extreme.
Let me give you going back to a previous, very rudimentary example where we talked about, two different worldviews which either accepted or rejected gravity. What essentially you're arguing for is what's wrong with accepting the worldview that rejects gravity? As long as everybody who's lined up to jump off the bridge and ultimately die, as long as we're making their time walking down the line as pleasant as possible. What if that gives me meaning and purpose? To hand them water and, pat them on the back and make them feel as good as possible right before they plummet to their death. Isn't that just as good as the worldview that accepts the reality of gravity, and therefore they make adjustments to their lifestyles to where they're not jumping off the bridge? And my answer would be, No, just because you've made people's journey slightly more pleasant doesn't negate the fact that you're not aligned with truth, and therefore you have some very negative outcomes as a result. So again, if and I'm not stating this as you have to accept my premise, but for the sake of argument, if there is a spiritual reality, then there are implications to that which go far beyond what meaning have I inserted or been able to enjoy or cultivate within my short time here in the physical realm. If there is a spiritual realm, then that means there is something after this physical realm. And so then I would ask, okay, what do you mean by beneficial to your community? Because if there is a spiritual reality and there is an eternal existence for humanity outside of the physical realm, then what is most beneficial for any community? To flourish here in our short little 80 years, or to propagate a belief system, a lifestyle, and an alignment with truth, which actually produces eternal consequences, positive outcomes, rather than negative ones. And so again, I'm not saying you have to accept the premise. I'm encouraging people to explore the premise. But if there is a spiritual reality, then there are implications we have to grapple with. And those implications are far more consequential than the 80 years that we happen to experience life here in the physical realm. There's a verse in Scripture that says, "What does it profit a man if he gains the world and loses his soul?" And so that is an existential question that we have to grapple with. Because ultimately, it doesn't matter if I have experienced, produced, or even helped others experience the most positive, beneficial, flourishing, warm and fuzzy lives that they possibly could have, if in the end they still jump off the bridge. And they therefore miss out on the greater purpose, the greater meaning, and the greater life beyond the physical that they could have experienced had they aligned with reality rather than rejecting gravity. And so there's more fundamental questions that we have to answer first before we can even get to the questions of meaning and purpose. And I agree with you. If a materialistic worldview is correct, then do whatever you want to do. I literally couldn't care less. Whatever brings you purpose and meaning or any warm and fuzzy feelings, go for it, unless that happens to be mass murder or cannibalism or something which I would rather stray from.
But let's break that down, because, okay, let's play that game. If that worldview is correct, right, we can still agree that mass murder and cannibalism are not good things. And then my question would be...
We would agree on that, but one of us would have a moral or ethical foundation for that belief, while the other would be left with an arbitrary definition.
Why is it arbitrary?
Because there is no objective morality or ethics system within a materialistic framework. It's all personal preference or cultural narrative. And that's where the cultural anthropological perspective actually would come into play and say, who are you to say, that's very ethnocentric of you. Who are you to say that your culture's definition of goodness is better or more correct than some other culture's definition? Why is it that in a Western worldview, we have come to the conclusion that, murder is wrong or bad or unbeneficial, whatever word you'd prefer, whereas some tribal societies are perfectly, accepting of headhunting and cannibalism? Like, why is their definitions any more incorrect or wrong than yours? Well, in a materialistic framework, they can't be. Any meaning, any moral judgment is completely arbitrary and subjective according to the individual or the culture. Whereas in a spiritual framework, you have something to ground morality in and say, no, objectively, X, Y, or Z is good and A, B, C is bad, because these morals come from a higher reality and a higher authority than us. So therefore, they are not subjective, they are objective. Now, again, within the Western context, what we see is that those who claim materialism or atheism, they largely align, not coincidentally, with a Judeo-Christian ethic, because they've been raised in that culture as well, and so there is an ethnocentricity in that regard, in that this is the culture, this is the kind of the moral framework which they have been raised and they largely accept. However, they want to reject the foundation of that framework and just accept the framework as floating nebulously in the sky. And I don't have any problem with that according to their own framework, other than when they try to invoke objective metrics and say, well, this is good, or this is best, or this is better. You can't use those words if you have nothing to objectively ground those morals or those ethics on. It's just opinion. It's just preference. It's just cultural narrative. It's just personal opinion. And so within a spiritual framework, there is an objective reality based on a greater, higher reality and authority. Within a materialistic framework, they lack that. And therefore, it's every man for themselves. There is no objective truth. There is no objective morality. There is no objective framework of ethics. It's whatever you want. And so again, if you want to be a materialist and use the Christian framework of morality, I have no problem with that, until you actually get into arguments of how do you justify that system, and how do you somewhat objectively compare and contrast that ethical framework with any other, and say, well, we should accept this one. According to what? It's all meaninglessness. There is no objective metric to measure any morality or any ethical framework within that worldview. And so the only issue I take is when people start trying to make objective statements when they claim to be basing that on a very subjective worldview. It's just logically incoherent. That's my only problem with it.
I feel that there is a level of nuance missing here. And this is the nuance between making it explicit and implicit. Because making it explicit that there is a belief system on which everything that you're doing rests, Christianity, then you have that guiding star that you can aim for, as we just discussed. But there can also be implicit spirituality to some degree. Because, and this is my personal feeling, so I think that people who take a secular perspective and who make the argument that meaning can be individually created instead of derived from something more profound, they act in a certain way. They don't kill each other, right? They have a feeling of guilt when they do something wrong. They have a voice in their head telling them to stop if they're about to do something that is not good, that is not well aligned. Well, a question that you can ask yourself is then, what is that voice? Right? It's your conscience, sure. Right. But where does it come from? And why does it tell you to stop? Right? Or to apologize if you did something wrong. You know, if you were tired and you just insulted somebody, but you didn't mean it, right? Why does that voice tell you to apologize? As long as you're not a psychopath and you do have a conscience, of course. You can break that down and you can say, okay, it's culturally created, right? That might be one answer. You can say, you've grown up in a society where your surroundings have taught you what is good and what is bad. And because of that, that voice in your head was developed, your thoughts were developed, and the voice later on in your life are echoes based upon that experience in the past. That might be one answer. Another answer might be that voice is God. Making sure that you align yourself to that which is good. I think that if somebody takes a secular perspective, either rejects God or says, I don't know if there's a God, right? Both are possible. One is a bit more arrogant, right? Because who are you to say that there is no God, right? How do you know? I think a more legitimate answer might be, I don't know if there's a God, right? That's at least, I think then at least you're honest. Yet, that person still has a conscience. They still draw upon something to align them to that which is good. And that's where the implicit part comes in. Because I think that that person maybe is not ready, and maybe might never be ready, to say there's a God, and I can align myself towards that God. Yet, the actions of that person signify an underlying spirituality, an underlying foundation, and that might be implicit spirituality. So, the reason why your answer gave me to a certain degree, because there's a lot that you gave me, but the part where you said that if there is no God, everything is pointless. I think in an absolute sense that makes sense, right? But I don't think that's applicable to human experience, because not everything with human experience is explicit. People are very complex creatures. People have very complex beliefs. People have all kinds of different histories and all kinds of different stories and traumas and beautiful things that happened and, whatever. So that thing that they draw upon might be spirituality, right? People might, after having a tough evening or after having done something wrong, people might have trouble falling asleep because they're conscious, because their mind is keeping them awake. They're telling them, it's gnawing at them, right? It's telling them, you messed up, do something about this. That feels to me like implicit spirituality. And you might make the argument that that person just needs to be guided in the right way to find the answer. And the answer might be Christianity. That might be very possible. But I think it doesn't convince that person to say, if you don't make it explicit that there is a God, everything you're doing is pointless. Even though I think that in the absolute sense, if you take it to the extreme, right? If you take it to the end of the story, to the bottom of the layers, let's say, I think there's truth to that. But that's different than human experience. I think there needs to be a better answer, a answer that connects more to what people are going through and to that implicit spirituality that might be there.
Yeah, but I think what you're describing here is cognitive dissonance in people who claim a secular or materialistic worldview and yet implicitly live as if there is a spiritual reality. And I think that is fundamentally the argument that I'm making is that we can concoct frameworks, we can concoct worldviews which reject a reality, but then as we live, we come up against reality, and so we start kind of intuitively aligning ourselves with that reality. And you're right, a lot of times we don't take the time to evaluate, we don't take the time to kind of self-reflect and investigate the cognitive dissonance between our stated beliefs versus our actual kind of lived experience or behavior or actions. And you're right, there are tons of people who have not done the ancient axiom or truism of know thyself, right? We don't evaluate our own lives to such a degree to actually understand or recognize that our stated beliefs and our lived behaviors are actually incongruent. They're not in alignment. You're absolutely right. There are tons of people who live in cognitive dissonance like that. But I think that in and of itself is a pretty strong argument that there is a spiritual reality, that we behave as if there is a spiritual reality, even if consciously we reject that truth. And so for me, that is a very strong argument that, again, the secular worldview is not holistic. It does not actually explain in totality the experience that humans across the board, across the globe, and across all of time have actually experienced. And therefore, it is not a good explanation. It might be a preferred explanation for some because they don't want to have to grapple with the implications of there being a God and there being objective morality, because that means that there is a certain standard which I actually will be held accountable to, rather than me just inserting my own definitions and my own ethical framework willy-nilly, whatever is most convenient for me at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a very self-serving aspect and element of the materialistic worldview, in that it does put me at the top of the food chain, and therefore no one can tell me otherwise. I can live however I want. But where is that conscience then coming into play? And that's a great question. Is that purely culture, just, enforcing its norms upon you, and you've been programmed, as it were, by that surrounding narrative, and therefore your mind is in tension with what it's been taught how it should behave versus how it's actually behaving? Or is there a spiritual component to that which actually transcends culture? And there's a social anthropological, answer to that. This isn't something that we just have to kind of ponder as armchair philosophers and wonder about. That experiment has been run. If you were to assume the premise that the conscience is purely 100% a social construct, it is something which culture has inculcated into each individual. If that were the case, then what we would see in cultural anthropology is that every culture produces a slightly different conscience, that there is no commonality throughout those experiences if the conscience is purely socially contrived or constructed. But that is not what anthropology has discovered. They have found that there are absolutes, there are universal truths which the human conscience dictates to each and every individual. First and foremost, that human life is valuable and sacred, and therefore it is morally wrong for us to infringe upon that right of another human in taking their life or taking their freedom or abusing them in some way. There is this universal truth within each and every human conscience, regardless of the society or the culture or the historical time period that they were raised in, that says human life has value. It must be protected. It must be honored. And so even within the humanistic philosophical framework, there is a common thread there that for some reason they can't ground it in any objective morality, but for some reason protecting human life is the greatest thing that we could do, in a humanistic society. And so we concoct frameworks and legal frameworks and ethical frameworks and societal frameworks to uphold that universal truth. But where did that universal truth come from? Why do we have a conscience at all? There is no explanation for that. Evolutionists have tried and failed miserably, both from a chemical, biological evolutionary perspective, as well as from a societal evolutionary perspective. There is no physical mechanism which could produce that belief, because it is a belief. It is not a physical reality. It is a reality. It is a concept, and there is no chain or code of DNA that can pass down a concept from one generation to another. So where does this universal truth come from? The most basic explanation of that is that there is something greater or deeper than just the physical reality. There is another realm or another world or higher reality which we have to also incorporate into our understanding of the world around us.
I'm going to ask you a couple of questions, more questions, Joshua, and I think I'm going to take this perspective for the rest of the conversation, the secular perspective. Again, not necessarily because this is my personal perspective, but I think that the answers that you're giving are very interesting, and I would like to push back there. One thing that you said so when we talked about that implicit spirituality, right? You said that makes a very strong case that there is a spiritual dimension that you actually acknowledge if you say that there is a form of implicit spirituality that you're operating on, right? Makes sense. But then you said a couple of things, but one of the things that you said is like, if you then won't acknowledge that there is a spiritual dimension, then you place yourself at the pinnacle of the top again, and then you go down that whole path again. But this is where I would like to add nuance again, because maybe it is not a situation where people won't make explicit or decide or whatever that there is a spiritual dimension to life. Maybe they can't. And this is actually something I talked with a guest in the past who described it, and this is slightly quote unquote, and I'll probably paraphrase it not fully accurately, but pretty much what she said is, for the mind that is very analytical and asks a lot of questions and constantly wants to figure out what is the objective truth, in this case probably in a scientific sense, that person has asked themselves the question if there is a God. And I remember that in that conversation it came forward that I don't remember the exact context of that part, but the question that I asked was, what is stopping you from believing in a God? Because clearly there was something stopping her. There were attempts that were being made honest attempts to being made to really believe if there's something, right? But it didn't provide fruit. For some reason, that belief just didn't come. And this is, I think, something that people can struggle with, right? Because making explicit and truly believing in your heart that there is a God and that Jesus died on the cross for our sins and all those sorts of things. That is a step that people not always are not willing to take, but maybe cannot take for whatever reason. And I think there's also an added dimension there that generally I think it's agreed upon that the older someone gets, the more set in their ways they become. Right? We know that our personality doesn't develop further than when we are 24, 25 years old, right? So if we are 50 or 60, our personality is very rock hard. There's very little chance of changing that. So if a person was not in an environment for those first 60 years where they were able to cultivate that spiritual part of their lives, cultivate the spirit inside them, let's say, it might be very, very hard. Maybe it might be even be impossible for them to take that step and to acknowledge that there is a God. It's not necessarily, I think, because in your answer, correct me if I'm wrong, but in your answer, it felt like you were aiming towards people won't, like it's a choice, but maybe people can't, right? Because it's a big step. You can even argue it is the biggest step that someone can take, right? Saying that someone died for their sins, for them, and that they should aim their entire existence towards serving that. That is not a small decision. And it's not, I don't think it's necessarily a matter of willingness. It's a matter of ability. Maybe someone is not able to for some reason. And what I'm trying to do here, what I'm trying to aim towards is take your information, take what you said, which makes sense, but trying to formulate it in such a way that it is applicable to someone who is in that position and to understand it. Because I think that if somebody asks the question, hey, I'm trying to take the step, but I just can't believe for whatever reason. Telling the person, and I'm putting words in your mouth right now, so this is not what you said, but then giving the answer, then you believe that life is pointless. That doesn't help that person. So how do you connect what you just said to that person, to the person who acknowledges that there is a spiritual something, right? Because their conscious comes from something. Something is telling them to be good and to aim upwards. Yet, that decision into, well, not necessarily decision, but that step into believing cannot be taken for whatever reason. What does a person need to do? What is the answer for them?
Well, I think, step one is where do you fall on the idea of free will, right? Because there are frameworks, ideologies, and just individuals, who may not understand or have thought about those frameworks, but who implicitly or by default, let's say, come to the conclusion that free will is an illusion. For those people, yeah, that is a conundrum for a variety of reasons. Number one, if they believe that they were fated, to believe whatever they currently believe, and likewise they were fated to change their beliefs at all of the times in their past which they changed, then without free will, they're just riding the train to nowhere, and ultimately, again, it's meaningless. I don't think that is the majority of humanity, though, and honestly, even in the conversations I've had with people who claim to be fatalists or claim to not believe in free will, again, their stated belief versus how they actually live their lives are in conflict, because there is a natural or inherent or intuitive sense which humans live their lives as if there is free will. So I believe, again, that is a natural argument to the fact that free will is a truth, is a reality. And even if we reject that reality, we have a tendency to kind of live as if it were a reality because it is true. But once you get past kind of that fundamental argument, the next thing I would say, okay, let's just assume for a minute that you have free will, and that you can change. Well, then let's evaluate the evidence. If there is free will, do we see it operational? And I can say unreservedly, 100%, in all of my 20 years of working with people, I have seen people change their mind on a variety of topics, and I've seen people change their behavior as a result of their either explicit or implicit belief systems. And you're absolutely right. Kind of peak cognitive or personality development, if you will, or worldview development, I'm pretty sure the research shows kind of occurs by age 13. And then full cognitive development happens, in your mid-20s. But that is not to say that then everything that you've experienced in your prior 13 or 25 years of life has set you on a path which is unalterable. It just means that it's now going to be harder for you to make behavioral or ideological changes. But we see those changes happen in human populations all the time, whether you're talking about political belief systems or value systems or religious ideas or concepts. We don't see only young people able to make change, and then after 25, everyone is just set in their path and they never change again. That is not what the psychological or scientific medical data would indicate whatsoever. In fact, quite the opposite. And this has actually been a criticism against religion in general, but also kind of Christianity specifically. we have many cases of people having a religious conversion late in their life, like in their geriatric years and sometimes on their deathbed. And so there's a criticism actually there of like, oh, well, they were just, covering all their bases, before they died, just in case they were wrong, or, kind of narratives like that. Antony Flew was a famous case of this. Antony Flew was kind of the champion of atheism prior to Richard Dawkins. And Antony Flew, very late in his life, converted to deism. Not because he had a religious or spiritual experience, but because of the scientific research, specifically according to him, the scientific research into the DNA molecule was the converting factor for him. At that point, he's like, guys, this is ridiculous. Like, there's absolutely no way we can maintain this narrative that life came about by chance. Because Darwin came along and postulated that cells were just little globs of jelly, that life was so simple that it was just statistically probable for it to come about. But what the actual science has discovered is the insane complexity of even the smallest elements of life, the cell, and then even smaller than that, the DNA. Like, it's just insanely complex. It reeks of design. There is no way that you can come to a system of information theory without intelligence being involved. And so in human mind, the scientific appearance forced him to become a deist. And that was at the tail end of his life. So to say, well, people can't change after they're 25 because that's when their kind of cognitive ability has fully developed, or they can't change after 13 because that's when their worldview has really kind of solidified. It's true that it becomes much more difficult, but I have seen absolutely no evidence, just anecdotally, as well as in the scientific literature, that it's impossible for someone to change their mind after they've reached the high and lofty and wise age of 25. But you're right; it absolutely becomes more difficult, more challenging, because we do get set in our ways, but that doesn't mean that we stop reasoning. It doesn't mean that we can stop evaluating the evidence and stop, making decisions after that point. It just means that we will have, psychologically, or medical science would call these, neurological pathways in our brain. Those have become more entrenched, and therefore they are greater to overcome, but they're not impossible to overcome. It just takes more evidence, or more conversations, or more wrestling with those ideas for them to be able to make that change.
But to the person that is trying to practice some spiritual habits, was trying to implement some spiritual habits in their life, right? And they're trying to connect because they acknowledge there is a spiritual side. This is kind of rephrasing the same question, but I do know of cases where people have made that attempt and something is stopping them. Somehow they cannot come to the belief in their heart that someone died on the cross for them and that there is a God, right? There's a ravine here, because on one hand we're saying in that case there's something implicit that somebody uses to guide themselves, to orient themselves properly. But they can't make the step into making it explicit. Something is stopping them. What I'm trying to figure out is, what is that step? Because for some people, it seems that for a part of the population, their surrender, let's say, can come very quickly. Their surrender to Christianity, for example, can come very quickly. They can believe very quickly. Some might take years, and some might not ever get there. And what I'm trying to figure out, what I'm aiming for with this question is, for that last group, something is stopping them. And it might be not a conscious decision, right? It's not like people are trying to block it or reject it because they're just stubborn about it, right? It's It's there's something there that's stopping them from taking that step. And what I'm trying to figure out is, what is that? And what can those people do?
Yeah, well, I wish there was a one size fits all, answer to that question. I think there's going to be a lot of nuance and a lot of variability in that answer, depending on the person, depending on the culture, depending on their upbringing, depending on their education, depending on their religious background. Because to the previous point, in the book, I give an example of a woman named Ayan Hirsi Ali, who was raised Muslim in Africa, Northern Africa.
She was a politician in my country.
Yes, exactly. So
Yep.
you probably know her fairly well. Yeah. So she was a refugee to your wonderful nation, and from there kind of embraced atheism and was kind of mentored by the very inner circle of the new atheism movement. She's good friends with Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and Hitchens before he died. And then from there, now she's living in the U.S. And just recently kind of publicly announced her conversion to Christianity. So this is a woman who clearly had a previous religious framework, a background. You could say she was indoctrinated, if you will, into that belief system. That's what she was raised in. But then later in her life, I don't know exactly what age she was when she immigrated to your nation, but she was obviously made a shift, a change in her belief system later in life. And then well after that peak age of 25, then made yet another change, concluding that atheism was not true, and converted to Christianity. And so if you were to ask her, like, at each of those kind of critical or pivotal moments in your development of your belief systems, like, what was the thing? What was the thing that was holding you back? Like, as you of making that shift, but you weren't quite ready. Like, what was that thing that was holding you back? And I think in each of those moments, it was probably actually something different. Like, there wasn't a one thing that holds everyone back. In fact, it's probably not even one thing. It's probably a multiple factor equation that goes into each of those pivotal moments in our lives. In the same way that, other significant decisions that we've made in our lives. You and I are both married, for example. Like, what was the thing that made that decision for you? It would be really difficult for each of us to say, well, it was this one thing about that woman, that caused me to marry her, or it was this one thing about her that actually was causing me to question whether or not I should marry her. Like, there's multivariable analysis that probably goes into our decision making, because, as you said, we are complex human beings, and the mind is complex, and there's a lot of different things that we're considering, processing, questioning, and wrestling with at any given moment in our life.
Yeah.
So as much as I would love to just be able to give you a really cute and simplistic answer, I don't know if that's possible. I think what's more important than to be able to answer the question is for each individual to be able to wrestle with the question and be able to honestly evaluate where they stand, and honestly evaluate what is their hang-up. What is the questions or the issues or the elements which I'm wrestling with, and then take them to that next step. I think for most people, and I don't blame them. I'm not saying that they're evil or inherently lazy or intellectually daft or any of those. I think life is just, particularly in the modern age, life has a tendency to overwhelm us, and we get so caught up in kind of the survival mode or aspects of life of, well, I just got to get to work. I just got to make the paycheck. I've just got to pay the bills. I've just got to get the kids to school. I've just got to do this, that, and the other, We just get very wrapped up with surviving in life, and kind of, if you will, Maslow's hierarchy of needs. We have a tendency to spend the most of our times at those base levels, and we never allow time in our lives to wrestle with the greater existential questions. We never really give ourselves time to just sit and ponder and think and muse and wrestle with philosophical or theological concepts, because our lives are just so fast paced, and we're dealing with, how do I pay the bill? How do I put food on the table? How do I get my kids to stop killing each other and misbehaving, and all these things. So there's all of these tugs at us in life. And it's very easy to get caught up in the urgent rather than the important. And we lose sight of the greater questions, and we don't allow ourselves to ponder those deeper truths and realities. And then when we do kind of force ourselves to take time aside to actually have really serious and deep conversations like you and I, like, without, I don't know you from Adam per se, but just listening to you and hearing your questions, it sounds like this is a deep and meaningful part of your life to be able to wrestle with those questions. But I would ask you, how active or how conscious and kind of intentional would you be in asking those kinds of questions without it being within kind of a formal format within a podcast, right? Like, how much time would you take just at your daily job or picking up kids from school or whatever? Like, how many of those conversations would you just naturally have? And maybe you're one of those types of people that, everywhere you go, you're like asking really deep and hard and philosophical and theological questions. And, you're the life of the party, obviously, because everybody wants to have those conversations while drinking. But the reality is we have a tendency to live in very shallow spaces in our lives. And it takes great effort to actually go deeper.
Yeah, I think the answer to that question might surprise you. And so far in this conversation, we have started from a secular perspective, and you brought forward quite some interesting stuff. So I got stuck there, and to flesh it out a little bit, and now I'm going to do the exact same thing. And once again, I want to make very clear that this is not necessarily the perspective that I believe in, that I take as a person. But I do think it's a very valid perspective to think about. And the answer, the question that was asked earlier, like, what is needed to take that next step? That question needs a proper answer. And I'm not saying that answer should be simple. I'm not saying that answer shouldn't be individually crafted, right? Because again, and we've already said this a couple of times, humans are complex and humans need different ways in order to reach a certain conclusion. That makes perfect sense because we are all in different places in our lives, right? So per definition, we need to walk different paths to reach the same conclusion. That makes perfect sense. But there needs to be an answer to the question, what is a step practically that you can take?
Sure.
And I don't think that pondering the question is the right thing to put forward. Because let's say, in this case, let me take myself as an example. Let's say that I'm the kind of person who is right now I don't know how to take that next step, right? I acknowledge there's a spiritual side, but I can't take a step towards true believing. So let's say I'm stuck there, right? Just like that person that I spoke with earlier was stuck there. Okay, what are steps that you can take? And right now what lays on the table is take time and ponder over it. And then I can say, all right, did so, done that. For hours, maybe I spent, 10 hours a week on it, maybe more, maybe, you can go to church, maybe you can read the Bible, maybe you can talk with other Christians, just to hear them out. There's all kinds of things that you can do, but I'm still putting my finger on that thing that is unknown, but that is blocking, right? So that thing needs to be identified for people, right, in order to take that step.
Yeah.
And you might not say in your answer, okay, you need to do X specifically. That makes perfect sense. But just pondering it is pretty much standing still looking around you, right? On an empty barren landscape. There needs to be something that is guiding. There needs to be a guiding star, right, that you can walk towards. And what I'm trying to figure out right now with you is, what can that guiding star be exactly?
Well, I think I understand what you're saying, so I do want to give a good answer to that, but I also want to just take a step back first. I think most people don't ponder it, and that's the problem. Like, we're not actually taking time to think about these questions. We just default to whatever is most convenient or expedient in our lives, and we're not actually wrestling with them. So I do think, like, you cannot respond to information you do not have, right? And so this is why, particularly in our culture, we, at least on the surface or explicitly state that we have a value for higher education, right? We want people exposed to ideas so that they can actually wrestle with them, so that they can have discussions and wrestle with concepts, so that they can then make an informed decision. And within a Judeo-Christian worldview, or within a biblical worldview, that is also true. Like, that's why there is a strong value within Christianity of missions work or evangelism, of actually going and telling your neighbor, whether that neighbor is near or far, of the truth of God, His love for you, His acceptance of your punishment on Himself. So He paid that punishment for you so that you could be reconciled, and so that you could be in relationship with that which is good and holy and perfect and true. Because if they were unaware of that, it would not be something that would just be intuitively something that they would come to that conclusion and therefore respond to it. They have to be aware that there is a God who loves them. They have to be aware of what the identity of that God is. They have to be aware of the actions which that God took in order to reconcile them into relationship. And then they have to be able to respond to that invitation. And that is free will. Again, whether you accept God's payment of your sin or you reject it is your free will, but He is offering it to you, and He is offering relationship. He is offering purpose and meaning. He is offering life and life more abundantly. He is offering an eternity of existence beyond this natural or physical world. And so we have to be aware of that before we can grapple with it and then ultimately respond to it. And so for the person who is currently in the spot of, okay, maybe for the first time they're hearing some of these concepts, or at least maybe the first time they've heard them communicated in such a way, then there is a responsibility on each individual to do one of three things: outright reject that information and go about your life as usual, accept that revelation or accept that information and respond positively to it in saying, yeah, that makes sense. I don't know of any other religious worldview that aligns with that truth and gives hope in the sense that I can actually have a relationship with God, and that He is good and loving and kind and wants relationship with me. And so they respond and they say, I accept Jesus' sacrifice on the cross for my sin. I want to be in relationship with God. And then the third option is, I'm not yet convinced, but I'm not dismissing it. And therefore I want to do more research, right? I want to continue down that journey, but I actually have to make a conscious decision and be intentional about that. Because again, life will tug you in very shallow and meaningless directions and overwhelm you with the urgent rather than the important. But there's many people that I have conversations with that starts with just a simple question or a simple conversation that opens the door to deeper conversation. And they're like, I've never thought of that before. Can we talk some more? Can we have a follow-up conversation? Can I go do some research and then come back to you with some questions? And that is perfectly fine. I encourage that in some ways, even more so than just the snap decision to become a Christian, because then you're processing that and it's becoming your faith, and you're not basing it on someone else's answers or someone else's research or someone else's process. You're actually doing the homework yourself. And just like Antony Flew, after a lifetime of studying science, ultimately came to the conclusion that life cannot be random, it cannot be chance, it has to be designed. And then that opened the door for him to become a deist in a very similar way, which is, we haven't really talked about in my book, but that was the kind of the inspiration of the title, which is Mere Spirituality, because there was a book written by C.S. Lewis called Mere Christianity, and that was much the same process for him, is that as by his own admission, he was a very reluctant convert. He came into Christianity kicking and screaming. He didn't really want to. It wasn't because he had some, mystical or spiritual experience that convinced him that God was there. He was led to faith through rationality and reason. And so he came to the conclusion that it is logical that God exists. And of all of the religious possibilities or spiritual possibilities out there, Christianity most aligns with truth. And therefore, he reasoned himself into the faith. But that was a journey for him. It wasn't just this moment in time that he suddenly became, a person of faith. And so I encourage that journey for people, as long as they're diligent and genuine in that. Because if God is real, then God is going to lead you toward truth if you are open to him. Scripture makes that very clear. If Jesus stands at the door and knocks, and anyone who opens the door to him, he will come in. Scripture says, "Seek and you will find me." But it's the hesitance or reluctancy for us to acknowledge the spiritual realm, which kind of closes the door to even the possibility of us investigating those truths and those claims. And so just being open to that and actually being genuine and honest in your journey and in your curiosity is that third option. You can accept, reject, or further investigate. And I would encourage you to further investigate, because there is a mountain of evidence out there for you to discover. An old book back in the 70s, I believe, by Josh McDowell, an apologist, was Evidence That Demands a Verdict. And he went through much the same process with that book. There is a more recent book by an agnostic, kind of atheist to agnostic, called The Case for Christ by a journalist, Lee Strobel. And he goes through the exact same process of first being open to the possibility and then actually doing the homework to see if it checked out. And after they did the homework, they were utterly convinced. Yes, this is real. Yes, the evidence is astounding. And so it's not a blind leap of faith, which a lot of people think it is. They're like, well, I could never become, a religious person because I require evidence and I require rationality and logic, and accepting faith is the inverse or the opposite of that. That is simply not true. Logic and faith, or reason and rationality and faith, are two sides of the same coin. One will lead to the other. And so understanding that and understanding that, oh my gosh, I can actually engage both my head and my heart, and have a holistic worldview is actually possible, is actually quite liberating, quite freeing, because it doesn't restrict you. It actually opens the door to so much more than the very myopic or narrow worldview that we often default to.
One of the things that it seems that both sides, so both the secular side and the religious side, default to make that point, if you bring it all the way back to the beginning, is the Big Bang, right? And one side argues that everything is random, that the Big Bang, was first a very small pinhead, and all of a sudden it exploded with a massive amount of energy, and billions of years later, and we have planets and life on Earth, right? And everything was random, by chance. That's one side of the equation. So from that perspective, you would say that the person who takes that viewpoint needs to believe in one miracle, the miracle of the Big Bang, right? That randomness ultimately coming towards what we have now. One miracle. The other side, the religious side, has a different miracle, I think. It has the miracle of the creation of the universe. And it also has the miracle of God walking in human form on earth in the body of Jesus. That is also a miracle that you have to believe in, I think. And I'm not sure if this is the right way to phrase it. So correct me if I'm wrong, or if I'm misphrasing it, or if there's a better way to put this forward. But the reason why I'm bringing it forward is that it seems that you either believe in one miracle or you believe in the other. It's one of the two, right? And this is a pretty silly question. This is a pretty silly question to ask. Okay, let me just put the question forward. Can someone believe in God but not believe in Jesus? And the reason why I'm bringing it forward is because I know that within classic Christianity, you have the Trinity, right? So you have the Father, which is God, you have the Son, which is Jesus, and you have the Holy Spirit, which is inside of you. So I know that those are, and I know that all of them are not 33% God. All of them together, and even individually, are 100% God, each of them. That means Jesus was 100% God, God is 100% God, and the Spirit is 100% God. That is the way that is the way that it works. But it feels to me like believing in Christianity means that you have to believe that Jesus sacrificed himself for humanity. That seems, in my mind, to be believing in a bigger miracle. Not necessarily in a bigger miracle, that's the wrong way to phrase it. But it means believing in that specific miracle. Why do you need to believe in the miracle of God walking the earth in human form in order to believe in God? So that is kind of the way to phrase, can you believe in God but not in Jesus?
Well, I mean, if the question is, can you? Well, yes, obviously and demonstrably. There's many people who believe in God, but not in Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
The greater question is, again, which belief aligns with truth and reality. And there is, again, I try to apply the scientific method consistently throughout these questions. How you apply it may vary from situation or question to question. But the fact that we can actually apply it and actually test a hypothesis is critically important. There's nowhere in Scripture that asks people to blindly believe. One of the most obvious examples of this was after Jesus' death and resurrection. Famously, or infamously, I should say, one of his own disciples did not believe, right? And that was Thomas, who then became known as Doubting Thomas. And he said, until I touch the imprints, on his hands and his side, like, I won't believe. And to that doubt, Jesus did not say, "You worthless disciple." He did not respond, "Oh, ye of little faith." He accommodated Thomas. He said, "Here they are. Touch, see. It is me. I am who I claim to be." And so again, there was an evidence-based faith, which came into play for Thomas. And so some of us may be more skeptical than others. Some of us may require more evidence than others before we can kind of get over that hurdle and say, yes, X, Y, or Z is true. But within a Christian worldview, no one is expected to simply have a blind faith that cannot be tested, that cannot be corroborated, that cannot be verified in some way, shape, or form. And Paul made this clear even in his letters. He didn't say, hey, just take my word for it. He said, hey, go ask the others who were there. Like there's multiple witnesses that can corroborate what I'm telling you is true. He referenced 500 others who had witnessed the resurrection of Christ. And so there's multiple points where the Christian worldview is not asking you just to blindly believe, but is challenging you actually. No. Go test it. In fact, the greater narrative of Scripture is not just to be a textbook of truth, but to be a workbook of truth, that we are actually to apply it to our own lives, to test and see that it is true, that God is good, and that He works as He claims to have worked in history. And so there is a verifiability or a falsifiability within that framework that we all can engage in. And so when you talk about belief, a lot of people their default understanding of that word, or of faith even, is that I have to shut my brain off, not evaluate anything logically, and just accept blindly a premise. And that is not either the etymology of those words in English, nor is it the historical or philosophical or theological reality. Like, we are encouraged to challenge and grapple with truth and come into alignment with it based on evidence and experience, not just on presupposition, assumption, or acceptance of a narrative.
Okay, let me jump in there, because you went over it quite quickly, but you actually brought forward something that I think is very, very practical. Because that earlier question that I asked you around half an hour ago was somebody who feels that there's something blocking and who can't identify what that is. Back then the answer was ponder it, take time for it, right? And we went further than that, but that's where we got stuck. And I made a comment. There needs to be an answer to that question. That person needs to do something practical. There needs to be something that can guide that person towards developing, that spirituality for themselves, inside themselves. And what you just said is very interesting, because what you just said is, when you read the Scripture and when you apply the Scripture to your life, you will notice a result. And that result should be, if applied properly, good. And that is then the proof that whatever is written, whatever you have read, is indeed true. So is aligned with truth. This is a very practical thing to do. This is a very practical lesson, because technically what you're saying is, instead of just pondering, open yourself up, really take the time, and read some of the stories. And then think about them, and then try to apply them to daily life and check what the result is. Because if applied properly, the result is good. And therefore there is a certain truth in there, because you know that whatever you're doing is not creating havoc in life or creating chaos in life, right? It's creating something productive, something good for your environment. So that's a very, very practical thing to do. So that might be a very practical step to take then. And maybe something came to mind, something that a friend of mine said quite a while ago. Deeply spiritual person. Wonderful person. that person said that if you want to see the truth of if you want to see the goodness of God in life, look at the result. I'm paraphrasing it now in a wrong way, so I'm trying to find the exact words that were said. But it was something along the lines of, do good and look at what the result is in those people. And if those people bring something, they react good to it, or they their life improves in a measurable way, that means that you are doing something that is fully aligned with how it should be, with truth, let's say, quote unquote. And that seems to be almost identical to what you just said. If you read it, and if you apply it, and the result of it, the feedback that you're getting is good, maybe that is what a person needs to be convinced.
Yeah, because there's going to be, again, multiple levels of analysis. There's going to be physical truths and realities, which any spiritual worldview would need to account for and accommodate. There's going to be philosophical truths and realities. There's going to be abstract truths and realities. And there's going to be then theological or spiritual truths and realities. And what I really tried to do in the book is kind of break that down in different worldviews and what aspects or elements of that totality of reality they were addressing and which ones they were actually neglecting. And therefore, they were not a holistic worldview. They could not account for certain elements or aspects of observed truth, of what we actually experience as human beings in the reality we find ourselves in. And it's interesting, sorry to go back to a point, but it's interesting that you kind of make the point, like, there's conflicting worldviews out there, obviously, and if there is objective truth, they can't all be true simultaneously. Like, they are mutually exclusive claims. And so if you accept a materialistic worldview, yes, you go back to the Big Bang, life is meaningless, random, chaotic, chance. But you only have to accept one miracle.
I wouldn't say meaningless. I would say random.
Okay, well, I will clarify that point with ultimately meaningless. You might be able to derive some meaning within a certain moment or time or framework subjectively, but objectively and ultimately, a universe which came about by chance does not have meaning, does not have purpose. And so, but how you framed that was you only have to accept one miracle. But then on the flip side, from a Judeo-Christian worldview or a biblical worldview, you also have to accept a miracle. And so how you framed that was kind of essentially which miracle is more plausible, or which miracle makes more sense or is more logical.
Right, exactly.
And my pushback to that would be, if you accept a materialistic worldview, you actually don't have to accept one miracle. This is a kind of a common argument. I've heard it on from multiple people. I think even Joe Rogan, on his podcast kind of used this example, this claim, well, you just have to accept the miracle of the Big Bang. Well, scientifically speaking, that is inaccurate. In a materialistic worldview, you have to accept not one, not a couple dozen, but literally millions and millions of miracles in sequence in order for life to come about. Because the Big Bang itself does not explain everything that then comes after that. For example, the fact that a singularity without any cause and without any external force suddenly decided to explode and produce all matter, energy, space, and time that we actually observe in the universe, that does not at all then explain how that matter and energy was organized so delicately and exquisitely into the exquisite order of the universe that we find ourselves in. It does not at all explain how chemical evolution occurred and how compounds of inorganic material collected came together as organic material, and that though there was no life before, suddenly life sprang out. It does not explain at all how information in the form of DNA, which did not exist prior to life, suddenly exploded and began to exist after life. It does not explain how single cells became multiple cells, and how the systems and structures of a cell came into existence, which could copy itself and then organize itself and dictate to itself how to organize in order to build these exquisite creatures that we see around us. It does not account how sentience came into the picture. It does not account how awareness came into the picture. It does not account for how the mind and the will and emotion came into the picture. It does not account for how mathematics came into the picture and how abstract concepts can exquisitely not only explain but predict the universe around us. Because as an abstract object, math has no causal mechanism. It has no relationship to the physical realm. Physics cannot produce mathematics. Physical interactions cannot produce mathematics. Mathematics is an abstract concept, as Plato and other Greek philosophers quite in detail explored this concept. The abstract objects are not tied to the physical world. And yet if we're claiming that the physical realm is all that exists, where did these abstract objects and concepts come from? Well, they couldn't have been a product of humanity as a byproduct of our own intelligence or mind, because we discover these truths. We do not invent them. They pre-existed us, and they will exist long after we are gone. They are also not subjective. If they were a product of the human mind, math would work for me, but wouldn't necessarily work for someone else, because they have a different concept or a different truth that they are subjectively aligning with. And yet mathematics works across the board objectively, regardless of the human observer. And so if abstract objects are a product of mind, but they are not a product of the human mind, then of what mind did they originate? And so you're not talking about one miracle in materialism. You're talking about millions and millions and millions of miracles which had to occur in a very precise order in order to explain what we actually see around us. And that is why so many atheists, through study, have turned to deism and even Christianity, because the random chance argument just doesn't hold water. It's not one miracle you have to believe in. It's a whole host of miracles you have to believe in. Now, contrast that with a spiritual worldview, or what I'm going to put forward, obviously, from a Christian worldview perspective, but the idea that God himself is the miracle that we have to believe in. He is the only element of the entire reality that we have to kind of grapple with, who is not physical, material, or constrained to space, time, matter, and energy. He is the only thing in reality that doesn't within that bubble. But because he doesn't fit into that, well, then it actually starts to make sense how any miracle could occur, because we're just relying upon one thing that is outside of the natural realm. One being who has the power, the wisdom, the energy, the ability, if you will, to actually cause things to occur in such a way. And so in that sense, the spiritual worldview is actually more rational, or I should say less requiring of multiple miracles to be able to account for everything that we see. Because the materialistic worldview would state that, and you and I would agree, most would agree at this point, that the materialistic worldview started with the Big Bang. If that were true, that means space, time, and matter and energy all had a beginning. That means they have to have had a cause. And what could cause space, time, matter, and energy to suddenly exist, unless it was by definition spaceless, timeless, and immaterial, and had the agency or the will to decide in that moment to cause it to exist. And so when you allow for a spiritual realm or a spiritual reality, there's actually less miracles you have to account for, because it then becomes logically coherent. It then becomes a rational, stepped process, if you will, of how did we get to this place? Well, because we can go back and see that in each of those critical moments, there was an intelligence, there was a supreme being, a mind, an intellect, who was perfect in his wisdom, his knowledge, and his power, who could cause those things to align so exquisitely in order to enable life to come about at all. And so then you could get into the theistic evolutionary perspective of, well, maybe evolution happened, but you're right, it's just so, like, the mathematical odds of all these things coming into alignment so perfectly at each and every step is just ludicrous. So maybe there was an intelligence guiding that evolutionary process. But ultimately, you get back to the question of, well, if we do allow for a supreme being who is all-knowing, all-powerful, all-wise, why would he even need a haphazard process of evolution, which is based on random and blind chance? Why would he need that? And so there's all sorts of questions that you could grapple with, but I just wanted to point out that the idea that we're only having to accept one miracle in materialistic worldview and also one miracle in a spiritual worldview, that's not actually the case if you actually look at the science. However, I do agree with you in the concept of, given the two possibilities, let's just call a set of miracles in this scenario versus a set of miracles in this other scenario, which one is more plausible or which one makes more sense? And I think universally, just logically, rationally, a supernatural or spiritual worldview makes sense of miracles far more than a materialistic worldview, because the supernatural explains not only the source, but the cause and the ultimate power that would produce a miracle, whereas a materialistic worldview does not. It says it's just random chance. Well, if it's just random chance, how in the world did so many mathematically, astronomically improbable events occur one right after the other in order to produce the insane complexity of the universe that we see today? So one asks you to accept the existence of miracles without giving any explanation of how they could occur or where they could come from or what could cause them, whereas the other accepts miracles but then actually gives a rational explanation of the source and cause of those miracles.
Joshua, this is a very fascinating conversation. We are already a couple of hours in, and I want to summarize everything that we talked about just now, just to be absolutely sure that there's nothing skipped over and that the whole message that is being laid on the table right now is clear. And it was a very fun conversation, because the conversation started with me asking a question from a secular perspective, and we kind of stayed with that during the entire conversation. And I think that's very productive as well, because I think there's the secular perspective is certainly a very large portion of society. So I think that that's very useful to bring forward the two ideas and the two perspectives and to see what's what. And I think also, to a certain degree, you made certain questions practical, right? Like, okay, there's an acknowledgement. If you acknowledge that there is something spiritual, because for some reason you believe that your conscious is for some reason aligned to something good. And why is that, right? Why are we aimed towards goodness. And you don't think that that comes from a biological or either a societal education or development or whatever, then that means that there is a underlying assumption there that there is something spiritual in there. You know, it needs to come from somewhere. It's not just there. And I also think what you said makes perfect sense, that if you look at the probability of what created the universe, that everything around us is very well organized, right? The particles that flow in the air, the gravity that we experience that we can live on, you know, the life that perfectly balances itself out, that there is trees giving oxygen and creatures that use that oxygen and then exclude another gas that the trees then use, you know, that it's a system that keeps things that need to be solid, that keeps things that live, you know, that makes them breathe. It's a system that works very, very well. And if you believe that a system is purely random, it's kind of a weak statement to make. I honestly, if I would defend that statement, the only argument I could make is what we are experiencing right now is the result of something that's purely random. And because it is purely random, this is one of the conclusions that was possible. That I think that can be the only answer if you take that perspective. But I don't think you can dig any deeper than that. I would have trouble digging deeper than that. Because there is no other depth, I think, right? Because you accepted the fact that it's random. So that's it. That's the answer. There is nothing more profound.
That is the logical conclusion that you would have to come to. But the mathematical odds of our world being able to hit the, you know, statistical jackpot millions or billions of times in a row is so infinitesimal that the only way that you can even come to that conclusion is to, and this is the fine-tuning argument of the universe, the only way people from a materialistic worldview are able to come to that conclusion is if they accept by blind faith that there are infinite universes in existence, and we just happen to be the universe that got super, super lucky. But there's no way to observe those universes. There's no way to test that hypothesis. It is purely on blind faith that we have to accept that infinite universes exist. We just happen to live in the one mathematically, incalculably improbable one out of blind luck. And so you're right. That is a conclusion that you can take. It is not a falsifiable hypothesis, though. It is a conclusion that you have to take on blind faith.
Yeah, but then the probabilities comes in. What is more probable? That something was perfectly designed, or that there is a number that contains quite a bit of zeros that brought us to what we have right now, which is the random argument. And that, yeah, if you are a person of numbers, if you are a person of statistics, then that conclusion seems to be quite straightforward. But then, and this goes into the second half of the conversation we had, is okay, how do you move forward then, right? How do you take that next step? Because there might be an acknowledgement over there, like, okay, you know what? It seems to me that it's more probable that something created the universe, right? But I'm not ready to take a step into believing that somebody died on the cross for me, right? That's then a step further. So how do you move them forward? And this is where the pondering stuff came in. But then that was also made very practical, because then you said, okay, there is something out there. There is a belief system out there, multiple belief systems rather, but in this case we're talking about Christianity, that provide an answer to those questions. And you don't have to believe right now. That's perfectly fine. But one of the things that you can do, and there might be, I don't know, dozens of other options, but one of the things that you might do is read the stories and try to act those stories out into real life, just to see what the result is. And if the result is then good, then that might give you some indication that you're at least on the right track, right? Because else you would get a result that wouldn't be aligned with that story, let's say. So that might be then the proof that one needs in order to move forward. Did I skip over anything important in your opinion?
No, I think I would like to add that there is another, maybe slightly more concrete or direct route that someone could take in that exploration. I believe in the book I bring up an example. I was in a conversation. Well, it started out as a debate essentially, but a conversation with an atheist who was very adamant about his beliefs. But as we discussed, he brought up challenges, critiques, and questions that he had doubts of Christianity. And as I was able to respond to those questions with adequate answers, his defenses were lowered, and he realized, okay, there is a logical explanation for that problem I have. There's a logical explanation for this issue I take with it, et cetera, et cetera. Eventually, we got to a place where he was no longer against the idea of a spiritual reality. He was quite open to it. And so, in essence, from atheism, he then came to the place of agnosticism and then was open. Okay, if there is something beyond the physical reality, if there is a God and he is who you claim him to be or who Scripture claims him to be, how can I verify that, or how can I experience that, or how can that be true for me whatsoever?
Right.
And I kind of led him to the next logical step of that, which is if God is who he says he is love, he is just, he is kind, he is merciful, and therefore we broke his law, and therefore he is just, and therefore he must punish us for breaking that law. But simultaneously, he is merciful, and therefore he took on the punishment for breaking that law on our behalf so that we could be in relationship with him. Then if relationship is the ultimate goal, what is our response to that? And different religions are going to have different claims to that. Most religions are not going to even claim that God is interested in a relationship with you. But if he is, then we would expect him to engage in that relationship. And that's where I encouraged or maybe even challenged this atheist. Tony was his name. I said, pray. Seek God. Scripture says, if you seek him, you will find him. He's not going to come and chase you down, pin you on the ground, and force you into relationship with him, because he actually values your free will. But if he is there and he is real, then we should be able to engage with him and him respond. Scripture says, that his sheep hear his voice, that not only can we pray to him, but we can actually hear him speak back and engage with us. And so I challenged Tony to start praying, and not from a place of skepticism or trying to prove that Christianity was a bunch of hokum, but actually earnestly and genuinely ask God if he was there, if he was real, and if Jesus was who he claimed to be. And I just left him with that challenge. And I didn't hear from Tony for weeks, but the next time I heard from him, got an email from him. He said, hey, strangest thing happened the other night. I was driving home from work, had time on my hands, turned my radio off, and just decided to take you up on your challenge. And so I just prayed, God, if you're real, if you're there, if Jesus did do what he claimed to do and was who he said he was, reveal yourself to me. And he said, I can't really explain what happened next, but all I can say is I felt a warmth and a presence surround me that I can't explain. And so from atheism to agnosticism to, I believe he kind of came to a place of deism, or at least an acknowledgement of a spiritual reality, because there was something that happened that he could not explain solely through materialistic or naturalistic explanations. And if we take this journey, there are going to be reinforcement mechanisms. This is not a blind leap of faith. This is a step of evidential process of logic, of rationality, of experience, of evidentiality, where God invites us to come into his presence, to test his claims, and he allows us even to do so with some doubt. There was a case in Jesus' ministry where someone came to him asking for a miracle, asking for a healing for his son. And Jesus' response was, if you have the faith, it will be done. And the father acknowledged, I don't have the faith. I don't believe, but I want to believe. Help me with my unbelief. And Jesus said, according to the measure of your faith, it will be done. And the son was healed. And so there is this, and just like with Thomas, there's this element, this aspect of like, God understands our doubts. He understands our skepticism. He understands our hurts, our wounds, our past, our upbringing, our cultural influences. Like, it's not that he is demanding of perfection from us or demanding of a certain performance from us. He meets us where we're at, and he invites us into relationship. And just like, I don't know if you have children, but young kids, like, we engage with them where they're at. We know that they don't understand everything. We know that they don't have the benefit of the wisdom and knowledge that we as adults have. And so we engage with them on their level, but we invite them and we train them and we encourage them to keep striving upward and onward, to mature and to gain a better understanding and to gain more wisdom and maturity so that we can interact with them on higher levels. And it's very clear throughout the scriptures that is what God does with us, that he is a good father and he meets us where we are at. He isn't telling us, well, you have to get your life together, your act together, your belief system, your ideology, your worldview, your values and your ethics all worked out to this point, and then at that point I will come and meet with you. No, at infants, though we are far from God and we are even enemies of God, acting against his law and against his wishes, if we turn to him honestly and earnestly, sincerely, and say, God, are you there? If you are, then I want to respond to that, and I want to live in light of that truth. He will meet us. And so that is a very I know you're looking for a practical thing, though this might sound very mystical. That is a very practical step that we can take. Yes, read the Bible, check its claims, go to church, listen to people who understand and who have lived this truth and reality for years or decades. But also you can go straight to the source. You don't have to take that on someone else's word. You can go straight to the horse's mouth and ask him, God, if you are real, reveal yourself to me. And I know many testimonies of people who came to faith in Jesus and acceptance of the Christian worldview because they followed that path. From Muslims who had dreams and visions, and then went and talked to a Christian and had their questions answered and were able to come to that decision, to people who just prayed alone in their closet and for weeks or months or years or whatever, and like C.S. Lewis, who then eventually came into faith through a long process of reason and logic, but then eventually coming to that conclusion and then experiencing God. We, like you said, we all might have different paths that we take to get to that truth, but God is not requiring a cookie cutter path or response from you. What he's seeking is relationship, and that is going to be nuanced, and that is going to be varying from individual to individual.
Joshua, thank you so much. As part of each conversation that I have on this podcast, what I do is a couple of things. I create a research brief that is a couple of papers long, and I create a bunch of questions just to prepare them. Just if there is a stalemate or just if there's a silence that falls in, there are some questions that I can fall back on just to keep the conversation going. What I noticed in this conversation with you is that aside from the opening question, not a single question was used. And that research brief, I didn't even look at it, not even once. That speaks to the power of this conversation. And I think it was really fun because I think it is At least that's the position that I was taking in this conversation. It's really fun to look at it from different perspectives and to throw rocks or eggs or whatever you want to throw at certain ideas and to see what sticks, right? To see what holds up and what breaks. And that's a really fun thing to do, because I think that taking a position and blindly believing it, like you've said a couple of times in this conversation, is not the right thing to do, because then you're just naive. Then you don't know what you're talking about. It's all about investigation. It's all about figuring out what's what, right? It's not just taking somebody for his word. Figure it out yourself. You know, there's a reason, right? There's a reason why our elders tell us certain things and tell us to do certain things, like exercise, eat healthy, those kind of things, and to not do certain things, right? Like drugs and alcohol and whatever. But somehow everybody still needs to experience it for themselves, right? Because that's what humans do. Humans don't generally listen to others very well, right? They need to form their own wisdom. They need to come to their own conclusions. And this is true in many different ways. This is true, for example, in leadership, right? That is why in my personal opinion, it's one of the most terrible things you can do is just order people what to do and say, trust me, I know what is going to happen, right? Just do what I ask you to. That's not going to work. People need to have their own vision. They need to know what they are working towards, right? They need to come to their own conclusions. They need to know for themselves that what you're bringing forward is true. That is, I think, both a flaw in humanity, but it's also a very beautiful part of humanity, because it makes people unique, it makes people beautiful, and it lets people define their own journey. And what you have done in this conversation is you have brought forward ideas and information and practical steps that people that have different viewpoints in life to at least consider, right? To at least try out if they're interested in it. Because like you said, it's an invitation. Nobody's forcing anybody, right? It's an invitation. But it does make sense. Both the probability about things like the Big Bang and how the universe started existing, how we are here where we are right now, but also the practical steps that somebody can take in order to cultivate their faith and to cultivate their spiritual side, and to ask themselves the questions, right? Where is conscious coming from, right? Why do we feel guilty after doing something wrong? Beautiful. So, Joshua, thank you so much for coming on and having this wonderful conversation with me.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I've enjoyed it immensely.